Hello and welcome to this latest TES web chat, beaming live deep from the bowels within Westminster. My name is Richard Vaughan and I'm joined today by none other than Shadow Education Secretary Stephen Twigg. Good evening, Stephen. Stephen is speaking to us ahead of a keynote speech he will be giving this Saturday at the Education Innovation Summit being held in Manchester. And we're very grateful that he's giving up his time tonight. So Labour are currently around 10 or 11 points ahead of the Conservatives in the most recent opinion poll, so I could be speaking to the next Education Secretary. So Stephen, we are just over 2 years away from a general election and we have a rather provocative question to kick us off with. Someone called Assembly Chew via Twitter wants to know, when is Labour going to start thinking about having an education policy?
Well, we've got an education policy. We want to make sure we get our priorities right for 2015. We don't want to have policies that are right for 2013 that are overtaken by events. Big emphasis in our policy on the importance of strengthening technical and practical education. That's why we've got Chris Husbands from the Institute of Education doing an important piece of work for us on strengthening that strand of education. Big emphasis on childcare and early intervention. We have a childcare commission. I'm leading that work. And we are doing some very detailed work on our policy on school improvement, and we will have an announcement on that at some stage this year.
Very good. Okay, I will just fire away with some questions from Twitter. So what are your top 3 priorities for schools?
I think the number one priority is about teachers, and that's why I put so much emphasis on how we raise the status of the teaching profession. I support a Royal College of Teachers, and why I worry a great deal about the low morale amongst teachers that I think there is at the moment. That's my top priority. The second priority has to be places. We've got parts of the country where there aren't enough places, particularly primary schools. If there's capital money, it's got to be geared to need. And the third, we've got to close the achievement gap. It's narrowed a little bit under the Labour government, but we've got to do so much more so that social class background isn't any longer the main determinant of how well young people do in education.
Absolutely. Ed Miliband has focused quite heavily on the forgotten 50%, and vocational studies have taken over quite a large proportion of your policy area at the moment. Is that something that you personally agree with? I remember speaking to you, you wanted to focus on primary schools. When are we going to see a bit more about primary schools?
It is absolutely right that we focus on the forgotten 50%. We did a lot in government to expand higher education, vitally important we continue with that work. But we lag so far behind the Germanys and the Switzerlands when it comes to technical and practical education. So it's right that we have that focus, but we are working on our policy on school improvement, and the earlier you start, the better. And that's why I find the government's cuts to early intervention such a big issue of concern. Because if we can make a difference when children are very, very young, even before they go to primary school, that pays off in the long run. I was with Graham Allen in Nottingham a couple of weeks ago. The work they're doing in Nottingham on early intervention is a beacon for the rest of the country.
Fantastic, okay. Kelly Rogers wants to know, where do you see the future of design and technology? Michael Gove doesn't seem to appreciate the importance of such a subject, and not only to creative industries, but also a life skill. What are your views?
Kelly, I agree with Kelly entirely. It was one of the major arguments we had against the English baccalaureate certificates, and it's one of the major arguments we still have against EBAC as a measure. There are several key areas of knowledge and skill that are excluded from the EBAC. Design and technology, creative subjects like music, drama and art, subjects like engineering, none of these are in the EBAC. They're being devalued. We've got to celebrate a broad and rich curriculum, both for life skills, but also, as Kelly says, for the jobs of the future.
Very good. You're going to be speaking about ICT on Saturday at the Education Innovation Summit. We have a question here from Gareth Davis. Does changing ICT to computer science, or computing, he says, in programmes of study mean children's life chances are narrowed? What is your opinion?
I think Gareth's question is a good one. I think it's right that we put more of an emphasis on things like programming. So I think the content of what Michael Gove's proposing as additional to the curriculum actually makes a lot of sense. But I don't think you have to accompany that by removing ICT from other parts of the curriculum. Clearly, those who aren't going to need to know about programming are going to need all the other ICT skills. We need to do both, and we need to have the confidence that we'll have the teachers with the capacity to teach those important subjects.
I'm going to move on to GCSEs and some of the government's reforms. What did you make of Michael Gove's U-turn on GCSEs?
Well, I welcome the U-turn, but he should never have come up with this proposal in the first place. It was classic back of a fact packet policy making. If we remember last summer, what he wanted to do was literally go back to O-levels and CSEs.
Indeed.
He got such a response to that he had to back down. So then he came up with the English Baccalaureate certificates, which got almost no support in education, but actually they were widely condemned elsewhere. The CBI report published before Christmas rejected them and called for a pause. So I'm glad they've U-turned, but I'm not convinced he's learnt any lessons from it. I suspect what he thinks is he needs to have an overall Tory majority so he can just get on with Plan A. What we don't need is to go back to that kind of two-tier system.
So is he right to reform GCSEs? Is that something that you would support?
I think we need to reform GCSEs and A-levels, but we need to do it in a way that is careful, that is based on evidence, that listens to the public concerns that properly exist. So, for example, I've raised today the government's proposal to separate AS levels from A levels, which I think are a complete disaster. Cambridge University has said that they will set back by a decade efforts to widen access to Cambridge from broader backgrounds. I can't find any serious person in education who supports what they're doing with AS levels. I hope we'll get another U-turn on them.
We shall wait and see. You yourself have hinted that you might look at the long-term future of GCSEs with the raising of participation age and things like that. Is that still the case?
Yes, we've asked Chris Husbands from the Institute of Education to look at apprenticeships, to look at vocational education, but also to take an overall look at the whole 14 to 19 phase. A number of people have made a very persuasive argument, the CBI, Ken Baker, David Miliband, that this does give an opportunity to look at the future of GCSEs. My own view is we need to get away from a focus on age. 16 is no longer the leaving age.
Yes.
There is a level of ability you have to get an A star to C in English and Maths at GCSE that I want all young people to get.
Yeah.
But some of them are going to achieve that at 13 or 14, some of them might not do it till 17 or 18. I'm less concerned about the age at which it's done than that we ensure that as young people leave the education system, they have at least got a C grade or its equivalent in English and Maths, because they need that for the jobs of the future and to live fulfilling lives as citizens in the future.
Absolutely. Talking about GCSEs, it's inevitable that we have to talk about the national curriculum, the proposed changes there. Janice Rush wants to get your view on the national curriculum and those proposed changes. What do you make of them?
Well, I think the curriculum's a classic example where I think we need to listen to the experts, listen to teachers, listen to young people themselves, and politicians need to tread carefully. And I'm worried at the level of direct political involvement there's been by ministers in the content of the new national curriculum. I think you want a curriculum that is a mixture of knowledge and skills. I'm not at either end of that spectrum. I think Michael Gove is moving it entirely to a knowledge-based curriculum. I think you lose some of the key skills that employers tell us are needed for the jobs of the future. But I'm not someone who thinks you should have an entirely skills-based curriculum either. You know, in history, I do think it's important that people have a basic chronology, that if you study the Second World War, you know something about the First World War. I don't think you can just teach history in bite-sized chunks without any connection. There's got to be an overarching narrative. I do think that. But I think the skills of critical analysis that are needed to be really effective in history matter. And if you have a purely knowledge-based curriculum, if you move back to rote learning, then I think you lose that ability to have critical analysis.
I guess one of the main questions, we've had quite a few questions via Twitter, Janice Rush and Keith Smith, they want to know if you do come into power, that's 2015, will all of the things that have been brought in be undone? So they want to know, such as, academies, will they follow the national curriculum if you come into power?
I think my starting point is that what everyone says to me is there's too much chopping and changing in education. We need more consensus, we need a more long-term approach. So I think those things that are utterly unacceptable, yes, they will change. Will I change everything? No. And I think most people in education will breathe a sigh of relief that I'm not going to try to change everything. On academies, my view is we want a level playing field. So I think that if the curriculum flexibilities that academies have got make sense, there's an argument to extend them to other schools. Equally, if we think that every school should be doing at least 2 hours of PE and sport a week, which I think they should be, that should apply to academies and free schools. So what we're looking at the moment is how in practice you could bring about a more level playing field on the curriculum. So you've got the flexibility that lets teachers make the decisions that teachers should be making, but you've also got some core entitlements that young people and parents can expect of any state-funded school.
Janice Rush seems to have asked quite a few questions here, but she also wants to know what are Labour's thoughts on forced academisation will they stop the policy?
I think the way the government are doing this is completely wrong. It's completely wrong. And the contrast I draw is from my own experience when we did the London Challenge. We recognised in London there were schools that were underperforming, that there were boroughs that were performing below what they should be. So we worked with those schools, with those boroughs to bring about change. In some places that included schools becoming academies or new academies being created, but there was a sense of a genuine partnership between central government, schools and local government. That would be my approach. So when I look at some of the schools that are being forced to become academies, sometimes an academy might be the best solution for that school. Often though it might be better for them to become part of a federation that links them with a successful local school that itself isn't an academy. The idea that you have a single, one-size-fits-all solution imposed from central government, I don't think is the best way to bring about school improvement. So, no, we wouldn't have forced academies, but we're not going to abandon academies. You know, we started academies because we recognised that underperformance was an issue. There will be academies, but we recognise that there are other great schools that are doing good things as well as academies.
And free schools? Will you keep free schools? Or will you keep the policy of free schools?
We oppose the policy of free schools. We don't think that it was necessary to create this new category of school. For areas of deprivation, areas of underperformance, the policy that we had was you could become an academy or part of a federation, you could become a trust school, which is a category the government's effectively got rid of. Existing free schools, I've said, if existing free schools are clearly serving their communities and they're fully subscribed, we're not going to close down good schools. We will have our own policy on how we create good new schools, and we'll publish that at some point later this year.
Look forward to seeing that. One question here which I forgot to talk about when it came to GCSEs. Would a Labour government, what would a Labour government do to encourage students to take foreign languages at GCSE and beyond?
I'm passionate about this. I'm partly for personal reasons in that I regret greatly. Yeah, I'm glad you asked it because
that's
a
great, by the way.
It's a good question, Luke, because I regret giving languages up younger than I should have done when I was at school. Now, I think the Labour government did the right things on languages, but we did them in the wrong order. So we said that primary schools should do more on languages, but before that, we made them optional effectively at 14. I think it's actually quite hard to say you bring back compulsion at 14, but I think we need the primary schools teaching languages from as young an age as possible. So the government said 7. If we can get every primary teaching it from 7, that's good, but where possible, let's start even younger. Because the evidence is the younger that children learn another language, the more easily they learn it, and the more likely I think that they'll love it and therefore carry on with it beyond 14.
So there wouldn't be any impetus from your side to try and reinstate it as it?
I don't think so. I think at 14, English, maths and science, vitally important, people do that 14 to 16. I think you need to have choice, and I think you start going down an EBAC style route. If you prescribe languages, there'll be an argument then for prescribing history and geography, design, technology. You end up then with no choice for learners and no choice for schools. So I think we did the right thing, but we should have focused on primary languages at an earlier age.
Fine. Tina Bourne, who's a deputy head at a primary school in Colchester, she has asked a question. It's quite a long one. There appears to be a great deal of opposition to the government's health and social care reforms, which also means welfare reforms as well, but opposition to equally heinous education reforms are more muted. The general public is not going to get behind opposition to teachers' pay or pensions, so is it now time for the teaching unions to affiliate to the Labour Party and together bang the drum for state-funded state education?
I mean, on that question, I think it's very much up to the teaching unions themselves whether that was something that they would want to consider. I think they would have to decide that. Certainly what I think is really important is that the teaching unions, the head teacher associations and ourselves work closely together to make the case for state education. Absolutely, that is the right thing for us to do. Now, from my point of view, that's making the case for high-quality state education, which is challenging because sometimes there's underperformance, but it's also making the case for teacher status, high teacher morale, and those are the issues that I discuss when I meet with the NUT and the NSUWT and the ATL and the head teacher associations. Let's work together. Their own political affiliations have to be a matter for them, not for me.
Are you comfortable with a close working relationship with the unions?
I think social partnerships are a really important principle. And I remember when I was a minister and we worked on the workforce reform agreement with most of the teaching unions and with the non-teaching education unions. You know, I think the role of unions like Unison and the GMB, which are affiliated to the Labour Party, in representing support staff in schools and in colleges is vitally, vitally important. They need to be part of of the education debate as well. I'll have my disagreements with the teaching unions, but I hope that they would recognise that we can work together in partnership if there's a Labour government. Whereas Michael Gove's rhetoric in constantly attacking teachers and
spoiling for a fight.
Spoiling for a fight, yeah, crossing the road for a fight, and
Yes.
teachers as enemies of promise. You know, this is not the way to work together to bring about the improvements in education that we all want to see.
Yeah. So just looking ahead then, I mean, what can we look forward to when it comes to your policy review, which is being worked on at the moment? What are the next things that are on your to-do list?
There's a lot, but let me identify three.
Yeah.
We have the husbands review, which I've referred to,
Yes.
and that's focusing on apprenticeships, it's focusing on vocational, technical and practical education, and 14 to 19. Really important to get that right. Early years in childcare, I'm chairing a commission on childcare. We want to make sure that early intervention is given the priority it deserves. It's having some of the biggest cuts from this government, so that's really important to us. And the third is the whole area of school improvement, where we want to make sure that the good schools and the outstanding schools are working to support the schools that are struggling. The lesson I draw from my own experience in government, particularly from London Challenge, is that's what worked. Schools supporting schools.
Yeah.
We're not getting that with Michael Gove's Academies programme.
Will we see a return of London Challenge? Will we see a return of things like that?
Very much so. I spoke in the Caroline Benn Memorial Lecture last November about the London Challenge, about the Greater Manchester Challenge, what we can learn from it, looking at what I described as the new arcs of underperformance.
Okay.
If you look 10 years ago, it was often the big cities like London and Manchester were below the national average. Now they've moved up. We need to look at coastal and seaside towns, and some, but not all, northern towns, where there is significant underperformance. So I think a London Challenge style approach will be at the heart of what our policy offer will be for 2015.
I'm afraid that's all we have time for this evening. Thank you for all your questions, and a big thank you to Stephen Twigg. That just leaves me to remind you that tomorrow the TES web chat will be featuring Simon Mayo, who will be talking about his hugely popular children's books in the run-up to World Book Day. And on World Book Day itself, that's this Thursday, we will be speaking to Tony Robinson, that's Baldrick himself, who will hopefully have a cunning plan up his sleeve to get people reading. So stay tuned for that. Thanks and good night.
Thank you.